the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, just dropped some guidance on the SB253 and 261 climate-related financial risk disclosures a few days ago. So we're just going to go through some of those points. To start with, the driver for the disclosure work has been in the Health and Safety Code. It applies to US companies that are pretty big. We're talking $500 million to $1 billion in annual revenues in the guidance documentation. And the initial report is due in January. So Luke, I think we have a bit more information about the timelines now, don't we?
Yeah, so it looks like the kind of the portal, or the docket as I call it, that you can start uploading information on is from the 1st of December 25. So a month earlier than the actual report due. And then you've got another 6 months from that point, July 1st, 26, in which to get the information uploaded onto the docket to comply with
in May 25, there was a public engagement process, and there are a few clarifications that have come out from that. One of which is there is exemptions of some kind for organizations that either provide insurance or that are covered by insurance regulations. So some companies will need to decide whether that applies to them. The other thing in terms of timing is it doesn't seem to matter which year you use, whether it's a calendar year or if you have a different fiscal year that starts later on in the year. The idea is that you use the most recent or best available data. If there are existing reports in place, you can use them, and so that they'll qualify as long as they're on the website, and then the link to the website is available in the docket that CARB will open. And finally, if organizations are part of a group and the group prepares its own report, then it looks like you don't need to duplicate that. You can provide a risk report on the overall level. So Luke, what about the frameworks that people are using here?
Yeah, so it's kind of giving you some guidance as to what frameworks you could consider using as a kind of structure. So TCFD being one, IFRS 2 being the other, but it's not really saying that you should be wedded to any particular framework. It's just suggesting that these two are probably seen as best practice, and in accordance with the regulated exchange and national government entities within the states.
I think what we've found so far is really this documentation is guidance, and it is a responsibility of the company, and the company itself needs to figure out which elements meet the needs of the company's investors and other stakeholders. So really, I think the responsibility here devolves back to the company around figuring out which risks they think are relevant, which ones are material, and they use this kind of lens of decision usefulness. So that's an interesting term. So will it be helpful for somebody who's looking at the company as an investor stakeholder in terms of understanding what's going on there? So I think there's a real onus on the company itself to take responsibility for interpreting the guidance and figuring out what should or shouldn't be in the documentation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other things I suggest as well is looking for supplemental guidance from your own particular sector. So you may be part of some kind of framework or benchmarking group within your sector, or a peer-to-peer review scheme that you can use to kind of supplement the TCFD and IFRS 2 as your framework when it comes to the guidance of how to report.
So that's moving on to the next page. This is a starting point, and as a result, it's not a law in itself. We have to go back and look at the existing regulations to know what is mandatory. But the whole point is, okay, they provide some guidance here. I think what's interesting is there are 5 steps that are set out in the rest of the document. The first one is this idea of a reporting framework, and as you mentioned, you use TCFD or IFRS or any of these sort of frameworks that are in line with regulated exchanges. There are some new ones coming out in Hong Kong, for example. Canada's putting out its own documentation. So, but there is this harmonization. All these various regulations are talking about more or less the same things. So as long as your report covers the basics, I think we're in a position where it'll hit most of those sorts of points. However, in the next section, I think is where it gets interesting. We start to have these minimum disclosures. So what are you seeing with what's happening with governance in this sector?
So the governance is seems to be more focused around the financial risk than anything else. And we've seen in more recent times the shift that's happened where organizations have gone from employing and onboarding huge sustainability teams and giving them the full responsibility for this disclosure. The shift is now moving towards, because the financial risk is such a big part of the reporting frameworks these days, the FDs, the CEOs are now the people that are given the responsibility, the ownership of the governance around these frameworks. And that's exactly what it's alluding to in this document.
Yes, in many reports we see that there is a need for hierarchy. You need to lay out the structure of management. But increasingly, the CFO or the FD is in charge of the overall activity around disclosures, and they might have various committees supported by the individuals and teams with the expertise to make this happen. And typically tends to be a mix of internal champions and a combination of external teams that bring in additional capabilities to provide that overall structure of what's going on. On the strategy side, this is a quite interesting one, because the whole thing is for organizations, they look forward and say, well, along their pathway, what are the pitfalls and roadblocks that they might encounter? So that's not an easy thing to do, especially around climate scenario analysis. So what have you seen happening here?
So what they're alluding to in this document is that we should be focusing more on the qualitative outputs from the data that you're gathering. As Karthik alluded to earlier, there is a minimum requirement for the disclosure. So it's the risks associated with the short term, medium and long term, as you'd expect. But it's more around the impacts of the climate related risks and the opportunities that presents, because it's not always around risk to the organization, what may happen. It's also what opportunities that might deliver when reviewing operations and the strategy that goes alongside it. So it's not just to focus on the risks, it's also to highlight these opportunities here to improve.
Okay. And what's interesting here again is in the minimum requirements, they are talking about description, describe what's going on with governance, describe what's going on with these impacts. And the quantitative elements, can be included. In this case, there is if you can do a scenario assessment, it's possible to do it in a way that is not unduly burdensome, then I think you're encouraged to put that in. And for some organizations, they have the choice. They might have done it, but whether they disclose it or not is up to them in this first year. They could hold back as well and bring it in following years as they see what else is happening with the market. On the risk management side, this seems like quite a straightforward aspect of, you need to have a committee that manages risk. Most organizations will have those. They assess the risks, they assess the likelihood and the impact of those risks. They work out the mitigating factors and then what the residual risk might be. So there's a overall structure around how you would look at risk management. And with this, for most organizations, it's really about including the sustainability experts and operation experts to bring in the elements around the climate-related risks and opportunities into the overall process. So again, it seems like the minimum requirements here are describe what's going on and then talk through the process and how it's integrated within risk management. So again, going by the point of it needs to be what you're doing already, just do it with including these elements. And I suppose finally, what we're familiar with is the metrics and targets side of things. So do you want to go through those?
Yeah, the interesting point here, given the links that it's got to 253 and 261, is it's not actually making it mandatory to kind of report on scopes 1, 2, and 3. It's kind of, it can be included, but it's not a minimum, which is an interesting point given the size of the organisations captured by this, the stage at which they're probably at, where they're probably already reporting on scopes 1 and 2, possibly 3. So the information in some respect is probably already there. To then put this statement within it to say that it's not a minimum to be included is quite interesting.
Yeah, so this I think can be read in a couple of ways. You have frameworks that say you can disclose if appropriate. There's obviously some stakeholders who've said, well, it could be a bit hard to get it done within this deadline, and so I think this term, it's not currently included for the by the deadline. It's probably an important one, which is it's going to come. It is going to come in. If not this year, something that'll happen next year, and next year you have the scope 3 elements as well. So I think there's a bit of a grace period here potentially, where organizations haven't got the numbers in place. Then this is the time to start thinking about putting those processes in place, start collecting that data. So by the time it comes around to the next reporting period, it'll be in place.
And we have seen these periods before with different frameworks that have been put in place where initially, things like this have been omitted or have been quite loosely worded, so that it gives organisations time to get the house in order, so to speak.
Yeah. And again, the requirements are, disclose what you have, and if it's material. So I suppose for some organisations, they might end up saying, well, our scopes 1 and 2 are actually a very, very small part of what we're doing. So at this point, we're not going to disclose them because we haven't got the data. Arguably, you need the data to know that they're small anyway. But there's a little bit of, well, explain yourself, I think, is the way to look at that.
Mm.
And again, finally, there's TCFD as a reference. So I think we'll stop here in terms of review of this document. But overall, I think the takeaway is there isn't much time left to do this. And depending on how complex the organization is, it'll take more or less time. So it's probably worth putting a team together to study the impact. But none of it is terribly difficult to do either. There is guidance out there, there is information out there. It's quite possible to pull this together in the time there is before the document opens.
There's a lot of overlap with kind of frameworks and regulations. So in terms of gathering data and pulling together what's required, I imagine quite a few organizations are in a good position with that respect.
Okay, we'll stop the recording here.